pretty excited about today because when Paul first approached me pre-Christmas about launching PlaceTech, he wanted to come up with a company that ultimately was going to bring insight to our sector and help find that kind of insight into what technology is going to have a profound effect on property and on the built environment. And so it kind of made sense to us to get involved from the start and actually start helping provide that insight to which companies are doing these things that will impact our customers, that will impact our commercial returns. So as Paul sort of said, today we're going to talk to you a little bit about energy markets, about some of the challenges within that field, about distributed energy resources, and also then about mass energy storage solutions and what we're doing here in Bright Building. Because when we designed this, we ultimately wanted it to be a test bed for technology. Not just to be a science park, but actually to be authentic, to adopt technology and see how it could better serve us and better serve the community of scientists and entrepreneurs that work here. So as Paul said, we've got a couple of those guys from My Idea, our innovation center, talking to you later. But it's, as Paul said, a bit of a double act, but really I'm more of a supporting act. I've got Bev with me. She's our head of energy. She's an expert in this field, so you're going to hear less from me. You're going to hear more from her. And as I say, hopefully we'll be able to give you some real actionable insight into what's going on in the energy market and how you can kind of perhaps look to implement some of this from a property perspective. So we'll crack on from there.
Morning, guys. As Tom said, I'm Bev Taylor. I'm the head of energy for Renn. Before we get into this, can I just put on record that I'm definitely available for the flights to Amsterdam. So anybody who wants to book me for another event, please feel free. Tom said we really see sort of the Bright Building in particular, but Manchester Science Partnerships has been a real hub of innovation. And I hope that some of the things I'm going to talk about today give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the things that we're trying to do, both across the park, across the Bruntwood portfolio, and I'll touch a little bit on some of the things we're doing across the wider city as well. Before we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of the stuff that we're doing here, I want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the problems that we've got. So, the first slide, you've probably seen this stuff, but the national grid, which supplies most of our energy, the electricity that we use both at home and at work, is really divided into three bits. Very simply, it's a power station here, it's the pipes and wires that transmit it from the power station to our homes, and then we use the energy at the other end. So we're the load that is pulling off the power stations. And the grid faces some significant challenges because the way the grid wants to operate is it wants to supply us, so it's got to deal with all the peaks and troughs that we have as users. It's always got to hit that peak demand when we want our power. But equally, it's trying to be in balance. So it doesn't want to operate as a peaks and troughs mechanism. It wants to try and stay as a straight line. And that presents some particular problems for us. As we become more dependent on electrical devices, we all want air conditioning, we all want iPads, we all want clever tellies, we're starting to have a real problem with the security of supply in the country. And that's very, very prevalent in Manchester. We've got serious problems. We're building lots of things, we're developing lots of different areas of the city, and we're trying to electrify the transport system, but the bottom line is the grid can't cope. So we've got an issue at the top with physically getting enough electricity for what we want. We have to balance that against, we all talk about the climate change agenda and the fact that we want to reduce our carbon footprint, so we need to balance that against the issue at the top. The third angle is that we need it to be affordable. We don't want to pay 50 pence a kilowatt hour for our electricity. So balancing these three things has commonly become known as the energy trilemma.
Oh, yeah. You go for it.
What's?
Just right.
Just right. So we've already got some significant challenges that we need to factor into our thoughts when we're thinking about how the grid is going to operate going forwards. On top of that, we need to overlay our forward view. So electricity consumption is on the rise. We expect it to increase by around 40% within the next 25 years. Because of the sustainability agenda, we're retiring all our coal plants. So as a country, we just physically don't have enough power generation in order to meet our needs. So we then start having discussions around things like Hinkley Point and nuclear power stations. There's a huge growth in renewables. So as we drive around, we see lots of solar panels and wind turbines and so on. That causes a problem for the grid because they're intermittent power generation sites. And the grid needs to, because it's trying to maintain this balance, it's difficult for the grid to predict when these assets are coming online and when they're dropping off. Electrification of transport, as we've said, we see it across our city with the tram system. We know that there's going to be a huge rise in electric vehicles across the next 10, 20 years. And we've got these two things at the bottom. Smart grid technology, which I'm going to talk about our smart grid later on today, and this carrot and stick thing around the policy framework that we all operate in makes it a very, very difficult environment for the grid operators. They all acknowledge this, and I think there's a general feeling now that certainly within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see much more flexibility. Now, the grid can't do that itself because the grid is basically a big line down the middle of the country with some spikes coming off it. So we will start to see a rise in decentralized energy systems, so things that operate outside of the normal grid environment. Now, sometimes we talk about these as microgrids. Sorry, I've got carried away with myself there. Sometimes talk about these as microgrids, or you might hear the term decentralized energy resources, decentralized energy systems. They're all the same. It's something that basically is trying to operate in its own way and isn't reliant on the national grid. And typically, if we're thinking about a microgrid, we'll be thinking about something that is an area where we've got some generation assets, so we're doing something to generate electricity, and we're using it in the same place. In very simple terms, that's what we're thinking about. The International Energy Agency think that by 2030, around 45% of everything we do will be supplied by these type of grids. So whilst it's not common at the moment, this is genuinely something that we will all start to see as we move forward. The reason that we're going to see it is, and after this presentation, please feel free to ask me if any of these things are of particular interest. But the reason that we will start to see the rise of this stuff is because of all of these things on the left-hand side, the 8 S's. As in this microgrid, because it's trying to meet supply and demand at a much smaller level, performs all of these functions. It stabilizes the grid. It allows it to operate in this way. It means when we're talking about shaving at the bottom here, where I'm talking about a system that operates like this, it means we can flatten these peaks down because we're operating in a different way. We're not reliant on one central system. And when we start to think about this in a property context, and we start to think how this might affect us as property companies, some of these things at the bottom around standalone operation start to become really important. At a different area of the park today, we've got a serious power outage that Electricity North West are trying to sort out. And that's having a big impact on us as the landlord. If you've got a resource, an backup power supply, UPS, whatever, obviously you can avoid some of those issues. And some of this technology will allow us to do that in a much more commercially viable way. The one at the bottom, shifting, we're going to talk about our mass storage device. Anybody who buys energy for a commercial property will know that there are certain points in the day where energy is exceptionally expensive. The energy day is broken down into a red, amber, and green period. If you're a purchaser and you need to buy your energy during the red period, you could be paying 50, 60, 70 pence a kilowatt hour for that. If you can find a way of avoiding those costs, happy days. And all of that is why we're moving to a distributed energy resource-driven system. The grid wants it, they need it, and it started to become commercially viable. it's commercially viable simply because in a building like this one, if we have solar panels on the roof and they're generating energy for us, we can choose to use that in the day to power the building. We can also choose, if we've got a storage device, to put the energy from the panels into the storage device and use it at a time that's maybe more commercially advantageous for us. And this is this idea of moving your load to a different point in time.
And so I suppose that's kind of where we then join with what are we doing here? Because you've got the kind of context of what's happening there and what's the opportunity. And so through actually a project City Verve that
Yep.
MSP and Bruntwood are both partner on, which is the UK's Internet of Things demonstrator project, Smart City demonstrator project. One of our theme areas is energy and the environment, and it's given us the opportunity to just explore this from an R&D perspective and actually leveraging some funding to do this work. So within that project, giving us some test data period, we've actually installed a Tesla mass energy storage system into the Bright building, which will then, over the next 12 months, as we start, as Bev's described, tiering on things like photovoltaic tiles, so solar on the roof, give us the ability to go off-grid. And that was kind of what we announced this week. We said we want to be fully resilient and to be able to determine how we can kind of best serve our customers within this building. And we'll use it as the test bed then to kind of take that across the park. As Bev's described, in Rutherford House, unfortunately, through some faults on Energy Northwest side, we've got some real issues. I've got guys in there with labs, and not all of their equipment's on a UPS. And actually, that's damaging their business. It's damaging their samples. And I think as we see from a property perspective, more of our companies, working within life sciences, working within technology, we can't afford to actually, be sort of subservient to that kind of main grid. We need to be able to provide them resilience. We need to be able to provide them, a better commercial option. And so for us, it is driven by customer, but also driven by opportunity. There's the commercial imperative, and then there's the customer opportunity. And I think that, is a really nice sort of helpful push towards, being more innovative in this space. From a funding perspective, we're going to start in a minute talking to you about how you can what this technology does, and Bev will go into more detail, but also how you can sort of revenue stack, how you can bring different commercial sort of opportunities together to make it viable, and also to make it pay back quickly. I think we're in about sub 5 years for this investment.
Yep.
And so, it's pretty quick. It's a pretty heavy upfront cost from a capital perspective. We're over, £250,000 on this stuff. But equally, we've had good help. City Verve provided a little bit of grant funding that worked towards it, because it was R&D in the way that we're going to be exploring this technology. And that comes ultimately through Innovate UK, the funding source. Lloyds Bank, we refinanced the MSP business just before Christmas. They've got a new green loan initiative that basically gave me a really good margin discount. Ultimately, the interest I'm going to pay on that loan over the next 3 years, and it was a 50 million loan, so it's pretty chunky, to invest back. And it made an obligation on MSP to invest £600,000 in renewable technologies that will reduce our carbon footprint of this site. So we take some baseline data and then try and reduce that. So there are funding sources out there. There's banks that are supportive, and then there's R&D budgets that can equally help tier in. So I'll hand back to Bev to kind of, again, explain a bit more about how this solution actually works for us.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on a couple of points from Tom there, certainly Lloyds offer this green loan facility. Barclays have just introduced one as well. So it's definitely worth exploring, because it makes it much more viable for prop companies to start looking at this tech. I think equally on the City Verve side, Manchester was chosen as the UK Smart City demonstrator. And one of the things I think I was very vociferous about within that space was the fact that if we want to have a smart city, we need to have smart buildings. And we've done a lot on the smart buildings front, but something needs to link those together. So we need to have a smart grid. And this is where this sort of mass storage technology and renewable generation stuff starts to kick in. The problem for us, I think, has always been that whilst it's been an aspiration to move to this, and as Tom mentioned, my sort of vision for the park is that I want to create a virtual power plant across the whole of the MSP estate, which is great. Also fits in, Andy Burnham would like to do this across the whole of Manchester. He's recently made a couple of very public commitments around trying to make us the first carbon zero city, much more quickly than the initial trajectory. But equally, Andy is setting up a company which is going to deal specifically in the aggregation of this type of storage device, generation and storage device. And that's ongoing, that work's ongoing. So it's a thing that we can all already sort of touch and feel a little bit and start to make sense. I think one of the areas that has been difficult for people to get their head around is how it might work for them. I'm talking specifically really about our battery today, but this stuff doesn't need to be about your battery. It can be around having the ability to, having a clever BMS system whereby you can dim your lights at certain points within the day when the grid asks for that response. It could be that you turn your HVAC down a little bit if you've got refrigeration equipment. All of this can incorporate an offering within this space. It's about optimizing the resources that you've got. And some of the markets that you can plug into, we in addition to the battery, I mentioned EVs before. Across the way at Greenhays building, and if anybody wants to see it, I can show you this today. We've got a bi-directional charger. So if you've got an electric vehicle, it will allow you to charge your vehicle from the grid, but it will also allow you to put energy back into the grid. And again, this stuff is stuff that it will become mainstream. We will all start to see and use this stuff.
Bev, we just need to speed up. I realise we're over time.
So that's where we're hoping to get to. Smart grid, smart city. Top and bottom of it is, for us as property companies, revenue stacking is the key. It's about looking at what assets you've got and how best you can utilise them. These slides go into some detail around the revenues that are available for different aspects of a thing called demand-side response. This is responding to signals from elsewhere, but revenue stacking is the key. Some really chunky numbers here, which makes the business case stack up. Things to watch: energy markets in a period of significant flux, lots and lots of regulatory change. So whatever you're doing, if you're putting this stuff into your buildings, make sure you understand where the landscape's going.
Sorry, I wasn't saying that quick. Sorry, I realised we were over time, so I just gave a quick nudge. But I think in that, Bev then went into super fast mode, a bit like a Tesla car, into ludicrous zone. So I'll take 1 minute just to go back to the revenue stacking, because I think this is actually the important bit, which for you guys. And as I say, Bev and me, we're open to talking to anyone in the room now or in a future date about this stuff. But from a revenue stack, she described it: shifting, shaving, short-term operating reserve. The grid actually wants to pay to be able to access your battery. So when it has challenges, when it's basically got a power issue elsewhere, they'll suck power out of your assets ultimately. It will put load onto them as well. And it's these opportunities, and like I said, there's about 9, and there's R&D funds out there. So that's how you make these things commercially viable. These batteries, they'll add resilience to your building, but they'll also give you a better way to protect against these annual price increases. And they're not just going to be the commodity piece, it's like the non-commodity. As you know, everyone knows about Hinkley Point. Huge infrastructure investments are going to cause major price shifts for us. So that's why we think this is an important area. And that's why ultimately you can make these things appraise in a way that will give you quick returns against, a pretty chunky capital outlay, but at the same time, give you a real, USP for your customers and yourself as a property owner. So,
one last point on that from me. I think in terms of this revenue stack, within the energy industry, we know that prices are going to rise significantly over the next 5 years. And this is mainly due to a thing called the capacity market. So as Tom mentioned about Hinkley Point, when we hear on the TV around the government is committed to pay X pounds a megawatt hour for the development of this facility, in actual fact, it's not the government paying for that, it's all of us on our energy bills. We directly pay for that with an element within our energy bills. And that price, it's gone from £13 a megawatt hour, it's expected to go up to about £78 a megawatt hour. And that in real terms means for us, for each kilowatt hour that we use as consumers, instead of it being 1.3 pence on the bill, it's going to be 7.8 pence. And this is before we've put all of the other elements, the commodity costs and so on. So we're going to look at significant price rises on our energy bills. But it's within our gift to do something about it. The one bit of advice I would give to all of us who are thinking about this and where we might go, if you currently buy your energy on a sort of a single rate, a day rate, or a day-night rate, is to try to get more transparency into that and get a bill that's billed at grid supply points, so you can literally see all of these costs, and you can start then to think about how you influence them with smart tech.